All right, I think we can get started. Welcome everyone to our methods workshop this morning. I think morning works for pretty much everyone on the line in one way or another. I'm Alison Hamilton, really happy to be doing this workshop with you on designing and conducting focus groups in implementation research. And I'm even happier that I am joined by my dear colleague, Dr. Erin Finley, who will introduce herself in just a moment. This workshop is part of the UCLA Rapid Rigorous Relevant Implementation Science Hub, which is a supplement to CHIPS, and many thanks to NIMH for funding this hub. We have done a variety of workshops, and you'll see at the end of the presentation, there is a link to our YouTube channel where they will all be found, including this one, within a day or two after we finish it up. I just want to mention that I do have a pretty bad cold, so I may need to hand it over to Erin at different points, even more than even more coughing starts to happen, and apologies in advance for any disruption that my cough might cause. But we're very excited to share this content with you and to tag team on it as much as possible. So just by way of background, I'm an anthropologist, a professor in psychiatry at UCLA, an implementation scientist, and I lead this hub and am very, very, very passionate about methods. And Erin, do you want to do a quick introduction?
I just want to say thank you for being here, even though you don't feel well. This is endlessly fun to do with you because you're such a thought leader in this field. I'm Erin Finley. I'm also a medical anthropologist and implementation scientist. I'm a professor in the Department of Medicine and Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UT Health San Antonio, and also an investigator with the Center for Healthcare Innovation, Impact, and Policy at VA Greater Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Elena Rosenberg-Carlson, who makes all of this happen and who will be helping us as we make our way through. Just by way of procedure, we're going to do a quick poll in a minute. We do encourage you to put your questions in chat, though we may leave some of them to the end, depending on the nature of the question. Of course, if there's anything technical that you need help with, anything that you need us to repeat or clarify, we can certainly do that in the moment, and we will pause for questions throughout. But usually in these workshops, we get some questions that we need a little bit more time to address. So some of those we may leave for the end, and we'll do our best to leave a little bit of time at the end for a discussion. So I think with that being said, we can launch the poll, if you don't mind, Elena. And this is just to give us a sense of our audience and your experience with focus groups. You can choose as many of these answers as apply to you. So we know there are many, and we know there's different levels of experience that folks have with this particular method. So thank you for streaming in your answers. It's always very satisfying to watch. All right, I think that we have a really good amount of participation. Thank you so much, everyone. And that is really helpful just to get a sense of where folks are at. And, of course, feel free, in case you've attended workshops before with us, you know that we appreciate your perspectives and experiences with methods as well. So if you have things that you want to share from your own experience related to focus groups, that would be great to share in the chat. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so we just wanted to get started. Hold on. By kind of setting the stage and the context for our particular topic today, to remember that when we're conducting implementation research, there's many things happening quickly, and qualitative data are really critical to assessing context, to tailoring strategies, to identifying who is involved, who needs to be involved, who maybe doesn't need to be involved in implementation, to assess what's happening with interventions, to understand adaptations. And the list goes on. This is not meant to be a comprehensive list of all of the reasons why we might use qualitative methods, but certainly some of the key reasons why we might use these methods. And we want to focus today on focus groups. We have focused in prior sessions on individual interviews, ethnography. So again, those links are available to you at the end. But we haven't done very much on focus groups, and it is a topic that folks often seem to want to discuss. So that's why we chose this topic today. What we'll do is talk kind of generally about focus groups, what they are, some general principles and key characteristics, and we'll get into some design considerations, planning and preparing for focus groups, conducting them, and analyzing them. It is an ambitious agenda that we have. Obviously, we can't teach data analysis in 15 minutes. That section will get sometime during this workshop. So we really want to bring up more directions for you to go in, options, opportunities, and things for you to think about, and certainly lots and lots of references as well. But I think, with all of these topics combined, you should leave with a pretty good sense of what we're doing with focus groups, when they are and are not appropriate, how to prepare for them, etc. So let's just start with definitions. Always a good place to start. I was actually intrigued because focus groups, in comparison to other qualitative methods, have not actually been around quite as long, and they really started, if my reading is correct, they really started more in the 40s, mainly related to market research. So we don't have, hundreds of years of experience doing these, or at least calling them focus groups, but these have served a lot of purposes in many different industries and disciplines over the years. I think for our purposes, when we think about focus groups in relation to implementation research, we want to remember that focus groups, excuse me, involve collecting data through group interaction on a topic that's determined by the researcher. And I will say that if you want to read more about focus groups, David Morgan is a very, very major go-to person on this method, and you can't go wrong reading anything that he's written about focus groups. We want to distinguish focus groups from groups that are not intentionally about research, from groups that are not intentionally about discussion, and that are not opportunities for naturally occurring group discussions. So there's quite a bit of shaping that researchers do to create the focus group context, and to decide, what those topics are, who is going to be involved in the focus groups, how they're going to be led, etc. And this really covers some of the key points that we want you to walk away with today, all kind of concisely put into one wonderful sentence, which is that focus groups are, each focus group is a single entity within a sample of groups. So it's not an interview with distinct individuals. It's not a shortcut for collecting data from several individuals at the same time. We want to also pay attention not only to what people say in focus groups, but what's happening in the group dynamic. And we want to analyze interaction dynamics. So there are some key features of focus groups that really differentiate them from individual interviews. And these points, I think, from our perspective, can't really be made often enough. So we want to make sure that we're not turning to focus groups as a way to increase our sample size. And we will get to this point a few times throughout the course of the session. So typically, these interviews involve groups of about 6 to 8 people. You can have fewer, you can have more. There are trade-offs when you have fewer or more. I personally like around 6 to 8. That's a nice number, where you would potentially have the opportunity to hear from everyone. When they start to get really small, they stop being focus group oriented enough, and when they get bigger, it's hard to make sure that you're hearing from everyone. It gets to be quite dynamic when you get 9 or 10 people. So we try to aim for 6 to 8 people, and these people share something in common that relates to your topic of interest. They're usually about an hour to 2 hours. We will talk a little bit later about virtual versus in-person focus groups. I've found that virtual focus groups, it's tough to do them for 2 hours. So that time frame really may depend on how you're doing the focus groups as well. In person, they do tend to last a little bit longer, unless, of course, they can't for people's schedules and so forth. But I would always aim for blocking at least an hour and a half, even if you have an hour-long plan. But give yourself time, a window before and after, as you prepare and then wrap up from the groups. Ideally, you will audio or video record your focus groups. I know it's not always possible to record. Sometimes in certain contexts, it's not appropriate to record, but this is very tricky data to analyze, and you're really going to want transcripts. So that is best facilitated by audio recording. Video recording, I have not done as much video recording because I haven't found that I work with the video data analytically very much, and it can be harder to make a case for it with your institutional regulatory board. But there might be reasons why you want a video and analyze, group dynamics based on video recordings. We're going to talk about focus groups in applied research, which I think is an important distinction to how you might use focus groups in maybe more highly exploratory work, in the sense that we're going to walk you through semi-structured interview protocol development, which is going to be more appropriate for implementation research, which we're certainly putting in that bucket of applied research. And you also may include activities or brainstormings in your focus groups, and we'll talk about those as well. Erin, do you want to take it over for a little bit?
Sure. So there's some things that we think about when approaching focus groups in general. So what are they really good for? So they're great for gathering kind of rich information on the experiences or practices or perspectives of the people involved. They can be a fabulous way to engage constituents in the conversation and sort of bring people to the table so you start getting lots of voices. Um, they're really suited for research questions that are best addressed by group discussion. And we're going to offer some examples as we go through here. So, but they can be fabulous for things like, how do we do things here? So if you're trying to understand kind of baseline approaches to a particular treatment in a clinic or something like that, they can be such a nice way of drawing out that conversation in a way that actually interviews might not be quite as good for, or might be used differently for. But maybe you'll have, okay, how do we normally treat a patient with this condition? And one person starts talking, and then somebody else starts adding something to the conversation. And then somebody else brings up an exception and says, hey, but wait, when it looks like this, we do it this way. And it's that really that how people can build on each other, sometimes argue with each other, but add different dimensions to the perspective on the problem that really gets to the richness of focus groups sort of in a general way when we're thinking about generalized research. Alison, do you want to add anything or do you want to go to the next slide?
I think we can go to the next slide.
Okay. And then you take all of those wonderful things about focus groups and you add in the piece about implementation. And when we're looking in these in the implementation context, they can be so valuable for understanding the context into which you're trying to insert this intervention, factors that may impact implementation. But they also have this piece where they can be a way of helping to make the work more action oriented. They give an opportunity even for something like proactive planning and solution development. They can be a great way to encourage people to be creative as a group and to provide a structured process even for doing that. So again, we'll talk through some different examples, but there are some real advantages to having focus groups in the arsenal for implementation research. So here would be one example, and this is a case in which we do include all of the citations at the end. So many of these things deserve a proper deep dive. So please feel free to go back to the original on these, but just to offer some examples. So this is a study where they use focus groups as part of a cultural adaptation of the Parent Management Training Oregon model, or PMTO. And the aim of this was a much larger effort, but they used focus groups as one step in the effort with the goal of assessing community level parenting needs among Latinx mothers and fathers in a particular county area. And they focused the discussions on trying to understand parenting and goals and barriers, and were inviting discussion of parents' concerns and challenges, which apparently parents were pretty excited to talk about. And as a parent, I understand once you get going on this, you really can bring quite a lot to the table. Um, then they took those findings and they really used them to not change the intervention, but to express the intervention to participants in a way that made the goals of the intervention really aligned with the goals of the parents in those groups. So the findings from the focus group helped them to tailor the way they were talking about the intervention, explaining goals to participants in some really practical and useful ways. And this is a nicely written paper, so very much encourage folks to go take a look.
Fantastic. Thank you so
And
much.
I do notice in the chat, yes, the slides will be shared. So we're hoping, we've tried to create them as a resource. So please use them that way.
Yeah, and we may, depending on everyone's questions, we may update and then circulate. So that's often what ends up happening once we hear what's on your mind. So we'll make sure to include any additional resources that we think about during the course of the workshop. Thank you so much, Erin. So let's talk a little bit about design considerations. I think when we get through some of these issues, you may have some questions before we get into the next segment. So we'll certainly pause in just a few minutes. So, if any of you have done workshops with Erin and I before, you know that we are very pragmatic people, and we really like to think about how can you use methods rigorously? What kinds of things do you need to think about? So we're going to get into some practicalities because that's what we love. One of the most important things to remember about focus groups is that your sample size is the number of groups, not the number of participants. Given that the unit of analysis with focus groups is the group, not the person, not the individual, that means that if you've done 4 focus groups, your sample size is 4, not 20 or 24, the number of people in the groups. And that's an important thread to carry through the workshop because it really will factor into your decision, your method's decision making about whether focus groups are right for what you're trying to achieve. And as you saw in the previous definition, um, we're really not using this method as a shortcut to having more participants. It just doesn't work like that. I'd say most projects have about 4 to 6 groups, maybe a few less, maybe a few more. The more diverse your participants are, the more groups you will need, because you need more than one group within each segment of your overall sampling frame. So the more segmentation you have, the more groups you have to do. This is something that often comes up as a question. Um, how do I decide how many groups? Well, it really depends on how homogeneous your sample is meant to be. Um, and if there are comparative aspects to your research question, how does one group think about this versus another group? Then you need to have enough focus groups with each of those segments to be able to even begin to compare. I don't think we have this on a slide, but it seems important to note, even at this point, that one of the things that is exciting about focus groups, but also very challenging about focus groups, is that they are highly unpredictable. You have no idea what's going to happen, no matter how much experience you have. You have no idea what's going to happen when you bring a group of people together into a setting, whether it's virtual or in person, to interact with each other. Even if they're people who know each other, you don't know. And so for some people, that feels a little scary. It definitely is something that you need to be prepared for, the fact that you just have no idea what's going to happen. But that means that, if we only did one focus group with one segment, it might just be an anomalous focus group. It might not go the way that you thought the group would go, which happens no matter how experienced you are. So you really want to make sure that what you're gleaning from the focus groups is reflected, um, that you're doing your best to get that consistency of information across more than one group within each segment. I wouldn't stratify too much because focus groups, as we will be sharing with you, are quite demanding. And they are, in terms of feasibility, there are a lot of things to consider. So you just want to make sure that you're not giving yourself too much to do with the focus group approach, and creating, way more work for yourself than you may need in terms of developing that sampling frame. We usually try to, if we're going to have stratification, maybe there's one variable that we're stratifying on, or two, but not a lot, because it will really increase your sample size. You also want to think about the extent to which you're going to kind of adhere to, a predetermined set of questions and procedures. We would really recommend, in using focus groups and implementation research, that you do stick pretty closely to the questions that you've designed. And we'll get into designing questions in just a little bit. Because chances are, number one, you will probably have more than one person conducting focus groups. So you want to make sure that the way you're leading them is pretty consistent with the way your colleague is leading them, because you want to have that consistent body of data at the end. Um, and so we would really recommend not sticking to the guide in the sense of, it not feeling like sort of a naturally flowing discussion, but being quite aware of what the priorities for data collection are, and that everyone on the team who's out moderating focus groups has a shared understanding of that. We talked a little bit about segmentation, and this is just one thing you're going to need to think about in terms of designing your sampling frame, as to how many groups you need per segment. I would say a minimum of two, per segment, but one focus group just is not going to be enough. Some examples, these are all in your reference list papers that pertain to these, and we'll come back to some of these examples as we go along, but I've done focus groups with residents or clients of treatment facilities, people who have a history of similar behavior, people who have some shared demographic or other types of characteristics. You might have providers or staff who are in similar roles. There's many options, but you can kind of get that sense that there is something shared and in common across your participants, and they know that that's why they are in the focus group, because of those eligibility criteria, so to speak. They know that if they're saying, yes, I'll be in the focus group because I have this and this and this characteristic, so they're coming to it knowing what the focus is and why they are appropriate to be participants. Another thing to think about in terms of design, is your role as the moderator. I will say that moderating focus groups is quite difficult. And you want to, if you're new to moderating focus groups, I would definitely recommend observing someone who has experience. It is unlike any other data collection approach that I've ever experienced, because there's so many things that you're trying to keep track of at the same time. You're, attending to the topics that are being discussed, where you are in that guide, how much time you have, who has spoken, who has not spoken. Is someone looking like they want to talk, but they haven't said anything? There's all these sort of meta things going on in your head that mean it's a very, very high level of energy that you're using as the moderator to create a very calm and relaxed, and hopefully calm and relaxed and productive discussion. So you can't really let folks know that you're going through all of that, because you're moderating and trying to keep a hold on what's happening in the group. And it is your job as the moderator to control group dynamics. So this means that you might have to let someone know they've been talking for too long, or it might mean that you call on someone who hasn't said anything yet. So you're keeping tabs on everything that's happening in the group and doing your best to try to hear from everyone. That is the goal. And there are different approaches to moderating, and those should absolutely be linked to project goals. I don't think we have a slide on this either, just coming to mind in terms of co-moderators. So 2 points I want to bring up here before I see what you have to add on this, Erin. One, that co-moderators can be great, but you really need to have a clear understanding with your colleague about how that co-moderation is going to happen. The time to work that out is not when people are there for the focus group. The time to work that out is well before, because if you are, and I speak from experience, if you are kind of in the zone of being the moderator and someone else on your team jumps in and you don't expect that to happen, it can really throw you off because you sort of have your vision of what's going to happen in the group. And if you're going to co-moderate, you need to have a very solid relationship with that person who's co-moderating, so that you know their style, you know when to turn it over to them, etc. So I generally don't recommend having two moderators. It can get a little confusing for the group as well, but I have done some groups where there was a reason for a co-moderator and it worked out really well. So it's not like a never do it type of thing, but just think really carefully about what that's going to look like. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention about dynamics is that I like as much as possible to let people know in the very beginning what's going to happen in the group. So I say, I might call on you. You don't have to answer. You can say I pass, or I don't have anything to add. I let them know that I might cut them off, not, disrespectfully, but let them know that, we're here to try to hear from everyone. And so I might gently say, that's a really interesting place that you're going, and let's see if we have time at the end to come back to that. So as much as possible to prepare your participants for what's going to happen in the group and how you're going to behave as a moderator can really help with, having a smooth focus group process. Erin, what kinds of things do you want to add to that?
No, I just love what you were saying. I've got two thoughts. One is about, for me, it always feels like you're conducting an orchestra. I've never conducted an orchestra, so that if that's a deeply inappropriate metaphor, please correct me later. But that's what it feels like. It's like you're trying to make sure all these different things are happening at once. The other thing, it just reminds me, and we do have a slide later on about kind of how do we set up the focus group to help make all this easy. I think so much happens in the preparation. And if the preparation is there, it really does support the process going pretty well. And it really works better. It's another one of those instances where a lot of the work happens on the front end. But it also reminds me, I remember hearing Oprah say at one point that after every interview she's ever done, whatever celebrity will turn to her and say, "How did I do?" Because people want to be engaged in the process, and they
Mhm.
want to give you what trying to get. Most of the time, people are trying to be helpful. They're there for that purpose. So the more we can sort of let them know up front, hey, this is what this is going to look like. This is what we're hoping for. Then they can kind of relax into the process and everybody can get a lot more out of it. So the more we can sort of set the conditions for that, the better it tends to go. So I think those were really great, important points.
Well, and yeah, it just makes me think too that, as we're setting the conditions, we're trying to lessen that unpredictability a bit. And even within that, even within the framing and the contextualizing and the, sort of orienting that we do as moderators, there will still be challenging things that happen in focus groups. There'll be people who talk too much. There'll be people who don't talk at all. I just try not to make assumptions because sometimes you might say, well, this person hasn't said anything. Maybe they don't have anything to say. And I can't even count the number of times I've been surprised if I call on someone and they have so much to say. You thought like they were just quiet because they didn't have anything to say. But many times people are trying to be very polite. And so they're like, oh no, I just wanted to make sure everyone else had a chance to say something. And so I do make sure to call on people, and it's totally fine if they say they don't have anything to add. But I've probably been more often surprised at what people do have to add once you just open up that opportunity for them. Um, Erin, do you want to take us through the next few?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a great article that Elena brought to our attention, and thank you, Elena. But we always get asked about, and certainly have grappled with the question of, do we do this virtually, do this in person? So it was terrific to find this article, and here's the link to it. But they make a great sort of summary of, hey, there's advantages and disadvantages no matter which choice you make. And they also offer some great ways to sort of grappling with those. But kind of for the briefers, and so we don't end up getting bogged down here. Virtual, it can be easier to schedule. There's some real-time captioning options, screen sharing options. It's usually cheaper because there's less travel expenses involved. It can give you access to folks in a wider geographic area, which can be hugely important. Certainly, we've done a lot of research with folks in rural areas, and virtual can be a game changer for involving and being inclusive of those populations. Um, in terms of disadvantages, if folks don't have great access to internet, that's a problem. I know my folks live in a rural area and the internet's really terrible and it just continues to be an issue. It can make consent a little bit more tricky, often requires more steps. Confidentiality is more complicated, and you are missing out an awful lot of information in terms of body language, how people sit together, how people interact together in the room. And of course, that group interaction is a huge part of the point. So that can be a loss. There can be more distractions at home. And Allison said this earlier, and I think this is really important. It's harder to keep them going as long because it's just difficult to engage people in quite the same way when you're not all in the same space together. So, look, a lot of the time we can't do in person options. So we go with the options we can. And in a lot of ways, virtual does have some options, but there are things to think about in terms of, again, always the purpose of your study, what you're trying to accomplish, and what's kind of feasible and pragmatic for your team and the folks you're working with. Okay, this is also where it gets fun. When are focus groups maybe not the best fit? And I hope that one thing that's really coming through is interviews and focus groups are just not interchangeable. They're just not. They're quite different tools. And I actually um, really appreciate the chance to do this workshop and sort of have the chance to articulate this because it's something I've felt for a long time, but hadn't necessarily sat down to really think through all the reasons why. Okay, focus groups are not always ideal for exploring sensitive topics. Now, we'll talk about an exception to that in a minute, but typically, if there are things that are a little bit more private or folks might view as private, it might be harder to get everybody in the room comfortable with being open about those in a focus groups. People tend to think they're easier, but they're actually really, really challenging and time consuming to arrange. Just think about trying to schedule a meeting with 8 people. It's not that easy. Um, the cultural context of research may actually matter here. I can think of group contexts I work in where having the group together might really support a more open discussion because people feel comfortable in that group and feel more open to talking in that group. But there's other contexts in which, people may clam up a little bit in a group, and you kind of just have to think about what's most relevant for your situation. Certainly, issues related to confidentiality and anonymity. Do the participants know each other? Is that make them more comfortable, or does it make them a little bit less comfortable? I'm thinking about an example with a professional group that was doing focus groups among the group. But the purpose of the group was actually kind of networking and a little bit of professional performance. And that made me really nervous because I just wasn't convinced that necessarily folks were going to feel comfortable talking about the complicated pieces of things. Again, these are all things to think about. Also, they're not going to be ideal for understanding processes if there's a lot of variation among participants. So, for example, if you were talking to a number of clinicians who generally function independently about how they do things, but they actually practice quite differently, it might be difficult to get that kind of granularity in what they're doing and why they're approaching it the way they are in a focus group setting. Or if you're talking about people from different sites, maybe their sites approach things really differently as well. So that wouldn't work. So there's going to be places where it works really well and places where it doesn't. You just kind of have to be a little bit thoughtful about that. And I think we have there we go. The other piece that's really critical is whether we're looking for group level data. If you really need to be able to get to the individual level to understand what individuals are thinking about an issue or experiencing around an issue, this is not going to be the right tool for that. We have to be able to think about what are we going to be able to do with focus group data. Again, we won't be able to speak to individual experiences. So we have to be thoughtful about that. We have to think about how we're going to be able to approach recruitment. Finding folks for focus groups can be challenging depending on your setting. And Alison has already noted figuring out who's the appropriate person to lead focus group or persons. Does require very strong interviewing skills. It requires group moderation skills. And it can be useful to think about how similar is the background of the moderator to that of the participant. It's not always possible to make sure that those backgrounds are similar, but it can be helpful when that's possible, and it's a great thing to be thoughtful about. Again, we'll sort of come back to these issues of reflexivity as they go along. Another thing that can be really important, and this comes up with the segmentation issue as well, is sort of how many groups do we need to break this down into, but just be thoughtful about differentials among the participants in the focus group that may inhibit open discussion. So for example, if you're talking with a clinical team, but you have everybody from, I'm thinking about a particular clinic that's a surgical clinic I've worked with, and in some of those conversations, you have everybody from the MSA to the key surgeon, the whole practice is organized around in that group. It's going to be difficult to make sure that everybody feels equally comfortable being frank if the power differentials are too broad, unless it's a group that's very, very egalitarian and safe. It's again, these are not deal breakers, but they are things to be thoughtful about. Is the focus group design going to ensure that everybody in that room feels very comfortable being open and honest about their thoughts on a particular issue? So this is a fascinating study, and Alison brought this to my attention. I hadn't seen this. It's a great one. I would really encourage folks to go take a look. So they actually they took a sample of 350 African American men, and I think this was in North Carolina. And they randomly assigned them to either a focus group, so N of 40 focus groups with 310 individuals across them, or an individual interview, N of 40 interviews. And then they gave them the same guide to sort of see so they could compare what kind of information they got in these different contexts. Super interesting. And the main focus of the analysis was on responses to basically a free listing question on common health problems in the African American community in their area. So then they analyzed the responses to this question. They found that focus groups and interviews both generated a pretty similar number of unique items mentioned. They found that interviews were more effective per person in generating a broad range of items. So if you break it down, say you got 100 things mentioned, but you're talking about the same 100 things mentioned by 310 people versus 40 people. It was much more efficient in the interviews. They also found, and this was interesting, some sensitive information was more likely to be disclosed in the focus group setting. Now, this is a pretty general question they were talking about, so it was not inviting a lot of intimate exploration of personal experience. But nonetheless, there were things that were disclosed in the focus group setting as opposed to not. And in this article, they hypothesized that might be related to the fact that the interviewer was a Caucasian, and I believe it was a woman. And they thought that maybe the folks in the focus group setting might feel more comfortable being with others, whereas in the individual setting might feel a little bit less comfortable. So I think when we're talking about what feels sensitive to talk about, it's not, there's not one answer to that. It may be complicated, but these dynamics and that reflexivity is really important. And again, it's supporting a situation where everyone feels comfortable being very frank. And again, they come to, it's a nice discussion in this article, but they basically come to the conclusion both of these methods can be used to generate good information. They found that the focus groups were a lot more intensive in terms of getting folks in the room. It required a lot more participants per data collection event. They were harder to schedule. They required more data collectors, took a lot more time, and came to the conclusion that individual interviews were a lot more efficient way to generate the data. But lest we think that focus groups are kind of a drag and not worth the effort, maybe we can go to the next example, because they can also be a tremendous way to make research a little bit more action oriented, particularly in the implementation context. So in this example, also a wonderful study, they conducted 15 focus groups with 83 direct care staff and managers in order to elicit perspectives on factors that enhance sustainability of implementation efforts in long-term care settings. So their focus was, how do we generate hypotheses about sustaining complex interventions in long-term care? And their analysis focused on features of the intervention that support sustainability, organizational context, and then external support that are supportive of sustainability. And then if we look at what they found, they were able to, break down all of these pieces. They found that in terms of intervention features, staff were really diverse in the training roles that they came into employment with these agencies with. So offering different methods for delivering information was really helpful, and that there was a need to both balance the complexity of being very detailed about the intervention, but also keeping it simple so it was easy to digest and integrate into workflow. They found in terms of contextual features, that was really important to acknowledge there wasn't always a lot of trust between staff and managers in these settings. And so it was, adopting methods that would be supportive of trust in the implementation was going to be helpful. They also suggested that, hey, there's a lot of staff turnover in these settings. So it was important to build changes into the program routine using trainer approaches and refresher sessions, and to really assume that there was going to need to be ongoing training and orientation for new staff as well. So this was a great example where they were able to use these focus groups to be action oriented in supporting future implementation projects. And they can certainly be used this way. And this is another theme we'll come back to.
Great. So we're about halfway through, and there's still a lot more to come. Oops, hold on. Just before we move on, I just wanted to check the, okay, some questions have been answered. If there's anything I'm missing, in my brief review, just let me know. I see, the one point, excuse me, about when co-moderators would be helpful. I find that for some of the studies I've done with focus groups, if my background, this is not always the case, but in some focus group studies, if my background is quite different from the participants, particularly in terms of language, that having a co-moderator who speaks the language of the participants can be incredibly helpful. So when I was doing focus groups with elderly and parents of school-aged children from Latinx communities. I had a co-moderator who was bilingual, and he really played a critical role in not like moment to moment translating, but as people were responding, sometimes they wanted to respond in Spanish, or sometimes he would clarify things in Spanish, or just ask in a different way. And it made a really big difference in terms of people's comfort. I mean, they told us that it made a big difference, so that was helpful. They said, you know, we really liked that that someone who could speak Spanish was part of it, and so that's just a consideration. Again, not a this is something you have to do each time, and it's sometimes it can be to your advantage to have a different background than your participants, because you can say, look, obviously I am you know, if it's obvious on some characteristics, my background, my experience is not like yours, and so I really am here to learn from you. And so it isn't a deal breaker, as Erin said, but is something that you want to be really, really thoughtful about and have, you know, an intentional plan. Okay, so this is our biggest section. So we'll run you through a bit of this quickly. We don't want to get too into the weeds here of using data in relation to the type of implementation research that you're doing. These are different on this slide. On the next slide, you'll be just seeing information about different types of implementation evaluations we might be doing where we're using focus groups, depending on the design as to when data is going to be collected, how that data will be used. And so we just want to remind folks that your design is going to impact how you think about your focus group guide and how you think about the timing of data collection, your sampling approach, etc. When you're doing implementation focused evaluation, there might be great opportunities sort of mid-implementation or at some key juncture where focus groups are a great thing to do, because you're going to learn about how much difference is there between what's happening and what you thought would happen, what your plan was, and what's actually happening. It might be a great way to learn about adaptations that have happened or that need to happen, or to learn about barriers to implementation, etc. Or it might be that at the end, for a summative evaluation, there would be an opportunity for group reflection on impacts and challenges, and bringing people together to do that sort of group think about what happened during implementation could be really useful. Now, in terms of what you bring to your planning process with focus groups, we're really not, and we mentioned before that ours is a very sort of applied practical approach where you're not using this method in a highly exploratory manner. It can be used in that way, but we don't really recommend that in implementation research, because we're going in knowing quite a bit. Probably we've had to propose the work in order for it to get funded, and so we've had to articulate what problem or gap we're addressing, what intervention we might be testing. We come to implementation work with an existing framework, theory, model, or maybe some combination thereof. We also have expertise at a number of different levels, perhaps on the team and among your intended participants. And we've, you know, gotten familiar with the literature, with previous studies. So we go in knowing a lot, and that is okay. But you want to be really clear on what you know before you do this type of work. And then, of course, what you learn through your analysis, through your data collection analysis. So developing focus group guides, big topic. One of our favorites to think through. How do we design good guides to just get us started with this topic? We'll orient toward the bigger picture, which is to create a guide that really maps clearly to your project goals and aims. It might be that you want to create a crosswalk to other data collection approaches within your study. If you have individual interviews as well, or maybe you have observations, maybe you have quantitative data, you could consider in your guide the inclusion of some structured items, like ranking or rating questions that can go kind of quickly and give you a nice body of structured data. And we'll get into activities in just a little bit. Because we're talking about implementation research, chances are that guide is going to be shaped by a conceptual framework. And so you want to think about how the questions that you're designing connect to the constructs and domains from the framework that you are working with. And we want to make sure, as with individual interview guides, that every question in your focus group guide is inviting, accessible, and analyzable. So these need to be questions that people will be inclined to answer, that they understand, and that are going to be useful for your project. And it really is that trio of characteristics that we look for with every question, whether it's a focus group guide or an individual interview guide. When we only have two of those, we might have questions that are very inviting and very accessible, but if they are not serving the purpose of the project and they're not really going to be analyzable for your project goals and aims, then you're using time for that question that could be spent on a question that actually gives you analyzable data. So you're kind of thinking about that real estate issue of, I have an hour with folks. I want to make sure that every question I'm trying to ask in that hour really matters for my project and is going to be appropriate for the participants. Even if you are using a theory, model, or framework, which presumably you will be in implementation research, this does not mean that you have to use every construct, and it doesn't mean, especially in the focus group context, that you have to have a question for every construct. You might need to address some constructs using other methods, and you really want to focus on those that are most relevant and appropriate to the stage of research that you're conducting and to the priorities of your project and of your setting. So we really want to aim for questions that are inviting and that have people describing what matters most to them. So you might take the construct of intervention characteristics, which is in common across many frameworks. And, you don't want to ask a question like, what do you think about the characteristics of this intervention? That's not a very interesting, inviting question. People might not even know what that means. But if you say, when you think about doing X, Y, or Z, what do you think is going to get in the way of making that part of routine care? So you're wanting to elicit people's perspectives in a way that feels more the way we would ask people questions in normal conversation. There are many, many constructs that you might want to address. We don't need to belabor these. You may have intervention related characteristics, and these, pull from a number of different frameworks. You may have contextual questions that you're interested in asking, questions related to leadership, structure, people, what people do, what relationships are essential for different implementation phenomena, readiness, motivation, burnout, etc. When you're formulating your guide, you really want to think about your participants and who is involved. And as Erin was mentioning, who are you putting together into this focus, very unusual context of a focus group? And it may be that you have different segments, as we talked about before, and you need to adjust your guides for different segments. So it might be that you've got, let's say you have 6 questions and you have providers and you have administrators. There may be 4 questions that are the same across those 2 groups, and then 2 questions that are specific to one group or the other because of their unique perspectives. So kind of building toward some common questions and then some questions that are specific to a particular segment of your overall sampling frame. And you need to really think about, as we've mentioned before, what you're going in knowing about your participants. So the way that you set up your sample has everything to do with how you set up your interview guide. And as Erin touched on earlier, it's really important to think about who you are in relation to your participants. We talk about this a lot in anthropology and other disciplines as reflexivity, kind of thinking through what your role is in the research process. And this does require a high level of self-awareness, reflection, and mindfulness to really kind of interrogate what you bring as the moderator or as a team member, how you will be perceived to the extent that we might be able to understand that. And just being very self-aware of power dynamics. And that's not a one-time thing. That's something that we want to reflect on before, during, after, long after, because our awareness is going to change over time, especially given how the focus group actually goes. And you want to think about how your knowledge of the participants informs the way that you're going to ask questions. So just to get into some specifics, I see some questions rolling in and I know I'm ignoring them. We just want to get a little bit further, just in the interest of time. So we have about a half an hour left and there's a lot that we want to cover. So please hang on to them and we will come back to them after the fact if we need to. We would recommend about 4 to 6 main questions in your guide, and that may sound to you like, wow, that's not enough. But if you think about the fact that each question is really meant to elicit discussion, and you want to have some key topics that people will be interested in discussing, how many topics can you really have folks discuss in the time that you have? It's, and try to ensure that most, if not all, people have a chance to answer each of those questions. So when we really think about the time allotted, the number of people who are there, and the depths of topics that we're trying to address, we really can't accomplish many more questions than that. You want to think about, when you're asking certain questions, the sort of flow and logic of the guide, and where you need to probe. And certainly, as with any interview guide and any instrument that we're using in data collection, make sure to test questions before you go into the field. That is absolutely critical. You can start with maybe some background characteristics. We might want to start with easier questions at the beginning just to get people warmed up. We want to have these kind of big topic-oriented questions. Those may be mapped back to your constructs from your framework or model. And we want to be really clear if there are multiple people conducting focus groups. We want to be really clear on what the essential versus optional probes are. I love people who've been to our workshops before know I always love talking about Bradley's idea of the grand tour question. Opening the focus group is probably one of the more not stressful in a bad way, but just, you just don't know what's going to happen. So you really want to open up this interaction in a way that's as comfortable as possible, but yet still meaningful for your project goals. So we are not advocates of meaningless icebreakers, like everyone say, what their favorite type of ice cream is or something like that. It's just not going to be useful for your project, and we don't have time for that. So you want to open with a question that is meaningful and analyzable and still appropriately exploratory. And you're going into designing this guide and in executing the guide with the knowledge of the participants related to what made them eligible to be there in the first place. So here are just a couple examples for you. In this first project, we were interested in the health and psychosocial concerns of older heroin users and how those concerns might differ by gender. So perhaps not surprisingly, all of our participants were older heroin users, and we did separate groups with men and women. And the way we started the focus groups was to say, let's start by talking about what you feel are the main effects of heroin on your life. Anyone can start. One thing you have to get really comfortable with focus groups is silence. And if I ask that question or, start with that statement, I will just sit there until someone answers. I have no problem just sitting there and waiting. And someone will invariably not be comfortable with the silence. They'll say, okay, I'll start. I'll get the ball rolling. So it is okay. You're really there to moderate. So it is okay to let that silence be there and let people start talking. We tend to want to fill in the silence. And so I might then say, what I mean is this, and because I'm getting uncomfortable and it's quiet, no one's answering. And so then I might start, saying the question in multiple ways, which just gets confusing. So just start and wait. It takes some practice. In another project, we were interested in the experiences and needs of women veterans experiencing homelessness. These were all women, they were all veterans, they were all experiencing homelessness. So we could start with a question like, let's start by talking about how you came to be homeless. Anyone can start. A couple other examples. You can start with a question like, we would like each of you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you made your way to this VA for care. You could start with a concept like a word that might be really critical to your project. In this project related to the introduction of telemedicine clinics, we started with this going around the entire group, asking everyone to share what they felt the word telemedicine meant, which was fascinating. And it was quick. It was a quick way for people to introduce themselves. And then we showed them a video, like a little couple-minute clip of what we meant by telemedicine to then orient the group. But we started with that more open, what comes to mind when you hear this word. So you really want to make sure that you're pilot testing your questions. That may be internal. It may be that you bring your questions to some experts. It may be that you bring some questions to people who are similar to those who you want to participate, but just make sure that you budget time for pilot testing and follow up. Okay. Yes, Rachel, I see your question. I would advocate for silence, and rather than asking someone specific to start, unless someone gestures in some way or otherwise indicates that they're like ready to go and they just need your permission to go. And I might say, Erin, it looks like you might have some thoughts on this. And so you're really trying to pick up the cues in the room or on the screen for someone who looks ready to answer and they just need that little prompt. But I love silence, especially in groups, because it really encourages people to start talking. Erin, anything you want to add before we go on to this section?
No, not really. I just want to underscore the importance of the silence and being okay with it. It won't go. There's another question about how long do you wait? It won't go on that long because people were, in general, we're not very comfortable with silence. And it's kind of good to establish at the beginning of the group that you're not going to be talking the whole time. The whole point of being there is for them to talk. So if you start doing a bunch of nervous talking, then it kind of sets the wrong tone. So it really can be a very valuable strategy. And it is not necessarily the easiest piece of this to learn. So it's okay if it takes a little bit to get comfortable with that.
Great point. Oh, in terms of establishing group dynamics, we just put some language in here for introducing focus groups. We don't need to go through this in detail because it will be available to you in the slides, but you're really just letting people know, here's what's going to happen. Making sure to make the point that what is said in the group should stay in the group. And that, we're going to be kind of managing what's happening with time during the group. There are a lot of different techniques to use in terms of leading and moderating focus groups. Engaging is can happen in a lot of different ways. It can happen non-verbally. It can happen by having some type of activity that you use. If you do have an activity, I don't recommend doing it right away. You might want to kind of establish the flow of the group and people's comfort level in one project where we had an activity where people were listing their top 3 priorities for quality metrics. We did that about halfway through the focus group. So they were already pretty comfortable with each other. They were comfortable in the setting. They were able to get something to drink. And then we moved into a brief activity. So if you are going to build in an activity, remember that they do take time. They need to be really specific and highly relevant to your research question. And you have to be very, very prepared, which we'll point out again later. As I mentioned before, being the moderator, your biggest job is to be an active listener. So while you're also tracking all of the things that are happening in the group and kind of monitoring who's talking and how much time do you have and where are you in the guide, all that needs to be happening while you're completely zoned in on what people are saying and actively listening to what they're talking about and being highly, highly attentive. You will find at the end of a focus group that you are probably pretty exhausted because it does take, you might be exhilarated too, but it does take a lot of energy because there's so many things happening for you as the moderator. And you may need to shift or adjust as you go through using your guide. It may be that people are kind of going down a road that is a little bit drifting from what you are there for. And sometimes you might use the technique of saying, I do need to ask you all 2 more questions before we wrap up. So I'm gonna steer us away and let people know. I'm gonna steer us away from this, even though it's really interesting because there's still 2 things I want to ask you about. These are general principles in any interview. Of course, you need to be prepared and positive, friendly, and curious. You want to know that interview guide cold. Be really, really familiar with your interview guide. The time to learn your guide is not when you're sitting down with a group of people. And you do want to be flexible. Maybe people start getting into a topic that you were going to raise in question 4. And you're like, well, this is what people want to talk about. It's in my guide. This is a semi-structured guide. Let's go there. So then you need to keep track of the fact that you've already covered that and that then you may change around the order of your guide. We've mentioned not being afraid of silence and also being politely direct and saying, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or, Shay, I haven't heard from you yet. Do you have something to share with us? So you can pause, you can, really kind of use all of your communication techniques to bring people into this experience. Of course, you need to document your process and monitor consistency of data collection. So activities, as I mentioned, can be great. They just take time. So you need to prepare, and that means if you're going to want people to write something down, make sure you have enough pens and enough index cards and like all of the aspects of an activity that are involved need to be very thought through, very planned, very, very organized. And they do take time. So you want to make sure that if you are including an activity in a focus group that is really worth the time. It can be, and they can be incredibly, incredibly helpful. But they are, taking some of that precious time that you have with folks. So when groups are going well, as Erin mentioned, the idea is not for you as the moderator to be saying a whole lot, right? That when it's going well, as the moderator, you are not actually going to see much of yourself in that transcript. You're not going to see a lot of your words. You kind of sit back and you listen to the discussion that people have. And hopefully people are communicating respectfully and they're talking to each other. They're not all focused on you, which is very different than an individual interview. You really want folks to be communicating with one another. I find that is a little bit more challenging in virtual focus groups because you don't have the in-person nonverbal dynamics to kind of communicate in multiple ways as much as you do, when you're together. And so there's a little bit more of that focus on the moderator in uh, virtual focus groups, but they can still be, very successful. If a group is not going well, it might be because there's friction. There might not be much interaction. You might have people who are kind of monopolizing things. And so it happens. I mean, it happens to highly experienced moderators. It's happened to me many times. I won't get into some stories right now, but I've had very tough focus groups, and they teach you a lot. And just know that if you do have a focus group that doesn't go super well, you are going to learn from it, and you're going to take what you learn to the next time that you use this particular method. You're going to do your best to redirect when things go wrong, and then just really do a lot of reflection afterwards as to what could maybe go differently the next time. In terms of closing focus groups, we draw on Spradley again in this idea of taking leave. Um, you might want to just ask if anyone has anything else they want to add at the end. Remind people that you'd like them to respect everyone's confidentiality and really express appreciation for their participation. We're, as moderators, really seen as ambassadors for our research projects, and you want this to be a favorable, positive experience for your participants. These are just some always points that you'll have available to you. I would really recommend having another colleague do the focus group with you in terms of being there to take notes. Not necessarily as a co-moderator, but just make sure that whoever is there has a clear understanding of what their role is. Are you taking notes on nonverbal communication, the things that we're not going to see in a transcript? Are you helping with consent processes or other types of paperwork? And you know, if there are other members of the team there, everyone needs to know whether they're going to be called on to follow up with questions. And that's a plan that is, going to be specific to your project. Okay, analysis, and then we can, in 5 minutes or so, and then we can see what questions are in the chat. I think we'll be okay with time. So one of the big things that we really want you to take away from this workshop is that the group is the unit of analysis, which we talked about at the beginning. With focus groups, we just can't really fully account for why individuals do or do not speak. They might be very engaged and not say something. They might be nodding, they might be like, yeah, I'm not saying anything because that person already said what I have to say. And so just because a certain number of people did or did not speak about something, we can't infer salience or agreement at the individual levels. That's why it's very dangerous, except under pretty particular circumstances, that we would not be analyzing our focus groups at the individual level. And I think we've touched on enough why one focus group really would not be enough. And of course, you have many analytic tools and multidimensional analytic tools available to you to work on focus group data analysis. Some of you are familiar with rapid analysis, that we have workshops available for you as well. This is an example of summarizing focus groups where we actually took the questions from the interview guide and then just summarized what people said about each of the topics that was raised in each question. This is explained more in the paper that's cited here. I just wanted to, show you a quick example of what our summaries look like, which is a bigger topic than we have time to get into, but more information is available here. And you do, as we talked about in the beginning, want to pay attention not only to what people have said, but to how they said it and the nonverbal dynamics that were observed. This is a big part of focus group analysis, is that it's not just about what the people, what their responses were, but how they were actually interacting and whether their dynamics actually teaches you something about the topic of interest. Erin, do you want to take us through a couple examples? If we have time, do you think we have time?
Not sure we have to. Maybe this one I just might point out again. This is another study. It's in the citations. This is a great article where they were doing focus groups with frontline clinicians in healthcare settings in Canada to look at tailoring implementation. And they did. This is one I wanted to pull in because they did use an activity where they broke down 3 recommendations of the particular quality improvement initiative they were trying to implement and presented those to focus group participants and said, okay, folks, let's talk about some strategies for how you would want to go about implementing these in your sites. So there was a lot of brainstorming around barriers and facilitators first, setting up the conversation, and then there was this clear activity. If we go to the next slide. And then in terms of analysis, one of the nice things they did is, again, they did combined some different strategies in their analysis. So they started with thematic analysis to go through all of the focus group data and identify reported barriers, and then also suggested strategies, and that was sort of emergent coding. But then they looked at those in terms of the COM-B framework. So they were able to map the barriers to different constructs within the COM-B framework. And they did the same thing with mapping strategies that were suggested by focus group participants to the COM-B framework. So this built them a mapping guide that allowed them to link, okay, when you see these kinds of barriers, this might be kind of particular strategies you would want to consider for addressing that, and use this to become a resource for future sites. So this is a great example in terms of thinking about how you might want to integrate activities, different strategies you can use for approaching analysis, and then also how you can use focus group data to create some really action-oriented tools to support implementation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. In terms of reporting your focus group findings, general expectations are that you would report on how the guide was designed, how many groups were conducted, how many people were in the groups, excuse me, the group composition, as we've talked about, how people were recruited, what you learned from your questions, what the role of the moderator was, how many moderators there were, what their training and qualifications were, and of course, your ethical parameters. And finally, we just want to wrap up with a slide that some of you have seen before in past workshops. Just thinking about methods and how do we decide what methods to use, what methods are best suited to our research questions. Of course, our focus today has been on focus groups where we really need to think about feasibility and appropriateness, given that this is a method that really focuses on group discussion. We want to think about its potential integration with other types of data. That can be a key decision-making point. If you're looking at using focus groups in implementation research, thinking about when strategically they might be most appropriate, back to the slides about different types of evaluation that you might be conducting, how and when you'll use the data, and how and when you'll analyze the data. So with that, I'm going to just wrap us up. There is a quick checklist here, just handy to think through all the things we need to remember when we're preparing for focus groups. There are several citations here. This is our YouTube playlist where this will be posted. This session will be posted, and there are lots of other workshops and beachside chats here available as well. And we want to acknowledge our colleagues and our funding sources who have absolutely, supported the development of our methods, knowledge, and work. And finally, thank all of you for being here for this brief workshop on focus groups. We will be sending you an evaluation afterwards, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback and let us know if there's anything that we can do better next time. And if there are other workshops that you'd like to see us conduct. So thank you so much. And I think we can come out of the slides and spend about 10 minutes or so on questions, which I have not been able to look at. So Elena, I might need you to take us through some questions if you don't mind.
No, I'm happy to. And Erin, I don't know if there are any that you've already seen that you'd like to respond to, obviously. Feel free to jump in. As I mentioned in the chat as well, there have been many, many, many great questions. And so we will do our best to make sure that any that can't be responded to on the line today are, receive responses after the session. So going back, this was about midway through the session, we had a question about member checking with focus group participants. So have you done member checking with focus group participants, assuming you're able to reconvene with the same folks after analysis?
So great question. I would say, excuse me, that the assumption part of that question is really key, because of course you have to have people's consent to contact them after the focus group, and you have to have a clear purpose for doing that. So you want to, if you are member checking, which would mean that you're perhaps consolidating and aggregating what you learned in the focus groups and then bringing it back to participants to see the extent to which it rings true for them and the ways in which it may or may not ring true for them. That needs to be tied to your research questions and to your overall study design and what your rationale and logic would be for that. So I would say, if you're feeling at all like if it's maybe more of a participatory design and you want to get, multiple rounds of iterative feedback on what you're learning, then of course that needs to be built into your consent process and into your timeline. It can be very time consuming to go back to people, but if it's serving a really clear purpose, it can be really valuable. Anything you want to add to that, Erin?
No, I mean, I'm a huge fan of member checking when it's done, with all the conditions you said. It can be really powerful, but it's a little bit specific in when we can use it, and we just have to be thoughtful about how it fits into the process.
Great, thank you. We've gotten a couple of questions about where it might be appropriate to use both focus groups and interviews in an individual study. So would love any kind of recommendations on that, and also specifically about when it might be appropriate to follow up a focus group with individual interviews of those focus group participants.
Great questions. So it really comes back to what types of data you need for your research questions. If I'm, and Erin, you might have a better way of framing this than my fuzzy mind has right now, but if you initially, like Erin made the point that, when you have a lot of variation in processes, like different sites do things in different ways, you're not going to get individual level information and specific and detailed information about those processes in focus groups. It's not a good match for that type of information that you want. So you may want to start with individual interviews pre-implementation to get a sense of usual care, let's say. And so you want to say, okay, how are you achieving this particular care pathway? And you get lots of detailed information from the different individuals who are involved in that care pathway. And then perhaps you're intervening on their care pathway. And midway through or at the end, you want to get more of a group-based or collectively oriented set of feedback about how it went within, the segments that are appropriate to bring together. And having people who have experienced something together come together in a focus group to talk about their experience of it might be a really good fit for a focus group, because they've been doing it together. And so they can remind each other, oh, but remember, then we had to do this. And what about that? And so that can be a really good opportunity to bring people together into focus groups to have them reflect on what happened in implementation. So that could be like a combination. In terms of following up with individual interviews with focus group participants, again, you just really have to have a clear rationale for that. What are you trying to achieve with the individual interviews that you didn't achieve with the focus groups? And if there is something that you really need to achieve with the individual interviews, then that might be a good methods addition to make. But remember, all of these are labor intensive. You want to think about your data analysis, you want to think about your timeline. And so if you are choosing to mix multiple qualitative methods, their interconnection and the way that you're going to execute that is going to need to be really, really well thought out from the beginning. Anything you'd add to that, Erin?
No, I really wouldn't. I think that was perfect.
Thank you. I think we maybe have time for one, possibly two more questions. So one question we got was whether there are any specific rules or sort of recommendations to help folks in deciding what constructs they should use from an implementation framework, especially if they're going into a focus group not yet fully knowing kind of where implementation barriers might be or what the implementation problem kind of is. So that's the question here. What constructs or how should folks consider selecting appropriate constructs?
I can take that one. I think Allison's having a little bit of technical difficulty. For me, I think that is always a tricky question. It's something we talk a lot about. But for me, if I were entering into a focus group with that kind of situation, I would want to start by uh, you can always start with the literature. The literature can be very helpful. If there isn't a lot of interest, literature in your topic of interest, it might be a great thing to cover in the focus group. I mean, we had some language earlier about, if you were looking at implementing this, what are the most important challenges that might come up in your setting, or what are the most important pieces of the intervention that it make it work well or not work well for you? So giving participants in the focus group an opportunity to tell you what is going to be most important in their scenario and their setting can be really, really powerful. And I always think of theories as sort of encapsulated knowledge. So maybe it's a framework and it gives you a way of condensing everything that has been learned about this in another situation or over time. But then you have to really see how to apply that knowledge in your world, in your scenario, and with your intervention in your populations. So letting them have a voice in that process can be really powerful. So I would probably start there.
Thanks, Erin. I know we're just about at time now. We do have a few more questions here in the chat, and thanks again for all the amazing questions from everyone on the line. So we will be sure to share the slides and recording with everyone after the session, along with our evaluation form. We'd love to hear feedback from all of you about this session and any sessions you'd like to have in the future. Erin, any last comments from you?
No, I just thank you, Elena, for always organizing it and making it run so well. And then thank you to Allison for leading it. And this was a wonderful experience for me as well. And she did a great job for being pretty sick. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and wishing everybody happy holidays over the coming season.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Erin.
I'm back by phone. Sorry, you completely lost power. Thankfully, it was in the last minute, but thank you so much, Erin, for joining me in this, and thanks to all of you in our audience for attending and for the great questions, and we look forward to future sessions. Thank you so much, everyone, and happy holidays. Take care.
Thank you. Happy holidays. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.